You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on Ash Wednesday, February 18th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in. So, my family and I are actually coming up on 10 years of being in Santa Barbara this Easter. And this week, as I was preparing for Ash Wednesday, kind of to head into Lent, it got me thinking about all the ashes we've seen in our world since we moved here. About a year and a half after we arrived, the Tom's Fire started. Does anybody remember that? Yeah, I still remember walking outside and seeing that red moon hanging in the sky with that strange apocalyptic glow. I remember evacuating my family because the parsonage was just right inside the evacuation zone and having to drive them down to my in-laws' place in San Clemente. And I remember having to drive back up to Santa Barbara to preach on Sundays in person in the smoke and the ash. And then as soon as service was over, I would drive back down again. I actually remember a lot of climate-driven wildfires in the past 10 years, like the bootleg fire in Oregon in 2021 or the Maui wildfires in 2023 that devastated so many families and landscapes. We saw, on the news, smoke rising from hillsides and neighborhoods and hotels. I think about also that ash-laden smoke rising alongside red, white, and blue at the Capitol building during the violent insurrection of January 6th, 2021. I think about the ashes of nearly 1 million American bodies and nearly 7 million globally who were lost to the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you believe we went through a global pandemic? I think about the smoke that was rising in protests in Los Angeles in response to violence against Black bodies after George Floyd's murder in May of 2020. And I think about the billows of tear gas that have been used by federal immigration agents on local civilians resisting violence in Portland and Chicago and elsewhere. Have you ever paused recently and just thought, man, as a society, we've been through a lot in these last 10 years, haven't we? In some sense, when you look at it all at once, it can feel pretty heavy, right? And if we're being honest, maybe after a year like this, we might want to ask the quiet question, is this ever going to get better? Ash Wednesday is such a time for reflection, for contemplation, for holding the events of these past years in loving attention, even those chaotic, unsorted, and destructive ones. It's a time to inquire of them and ask, how are they teaching us? What are they almost forcing us to let go of? How are they shaping us into the image of love in the world? Because if we're being honest, it's much easier to look away from the ashes. We look away because the grief overwhelms us or because our culture is addicted to youth and productivity and endless optimism, which feels out of balance with a hurting world. But perhaps there's an even deeper invitation when we look at the ashes of our world today. Perhaps Ash Wednesday isn't about morbid introspection. Perhaps it's about learning how to grieve well, how to release what needs releasing, and especially how to return to the sacredness of the present moment and to the aliveness of our one wild and precious life right in the midst of all that's happening in our world. There's a line in our sacred text that's always struck me as both tender and honest that says, we do not grieve as those who have no hope, right? Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say we don't grieve, right? It says we grieve, but not as those without hope. You see, grief is a sign of our deep love for one another, for those close to us, and also for the world at large. If there were no love, there would be no grief. Or said another way, I wonder if grief is actually a form of love. We grieve the tragic aspects of our world because we love it so much. And that is precisely where we find ourselves each Ash Wednesday, isn't it? Right in the middle of reckoning with our actual world, the one that we love with our actual lived experience, our actual mortality, our actual griefs, right here in the midst of the ashes. The Quaker author Parker Palmer writes, instead of responding with corrosive cynicism or irrelevant idealism, The nonviolent heart invites us to live in the gap between the way things are and the way we know they might be. It's a gap that has never been and never will be closed. That's a tough truth, right? If we want to live nonviolent lives, he says, we must learn to stand in this tragic gap, faithfully holding the tension between reality and possibility. So, the tragic gap is the space between the ashes of today and the new growth of tomorrow, between what is and what could be, between heartbreak and hope. And I wonder if what Palmer is opening up for us is this: to recognize that there's beauty in noticing that even in the rubble of what might be crumbling, there's a hidden invitation. An invitation not to deny reality, not to collapse into despair, not to numb out, but to stand, to stand in that tragic gap, to hold the tension, to refuse both cynicism and fantasy, to stay, in essence. Ash Wednesday is a training ground for that kind of presence. So traditionally, we often begin with ashes and this quiet reminder, from dust you have come and to dust you shall return. It's stark and simple, and yet there's something clarifying about holding our finitude close. There's something steadying, something that gently strips away distractions and brings us back to what actually matters. And if you've been here at Way Collective on an Ash Wednesday before, you've likely heard me begin with those words. But you've also likely heard me end with these ones: from love you have come, and to love you shall return. Because if we are dust, which we are beloved dust. If we're finite, we're held in this infinite love. And when we hold our mortality honestly, something shifts. The poet Mary Oliver once said, "To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes, to let it go." We live in an interdependent world where our great love for one another necessitates that one day we must let go of everyone and everything we've ever known. What a tragically beautiful human situation we're in, isn't it? Today is a day where we get to slow down long enough to really look at it, to recognize that to love deeply is to accept that losses will come. So to choose love is actually to risk grief. To hold one another against our bones is to know that someday we will release our grip. And yet we still love, don't we? Which means something inside us believes that love is stronger than loss. And in some sense, to choose love is to learn to become free enough to love and let go. That is the strange wisdom of Lent, isn't it? Traditionally, people will often give something up, right? Like chocolate or alcohol or sugar or scrolling on their phones, whatever it might be. But the deeper invitation isn't about deprivation. It's about making room for presence. So when we let go of something, even something small, we discover how attached we are, right? We discover how easily we drift away from the present moment, and we discover how much of our life we live unconsciously. Ash Wednesday brings that same clarity. When we acknowledge that our time is real and limited, love becomes less abstract and more embodied. We begin to ask, if love is the truest thing, how do I really want to live? What actually deserves my attention? Where am I being invited to show up more fully, more honestly, or more courageously? Because one thing we know is that more ashes will come, right? There will be more fires, there will be more illnesses, more political turmoil, more grief will come our way. And each time we will be invited as a community to stand in that gap for one another, to stand in solidarity between what is actually happening and what could be if things were more just, between what was and what might yet become. And this is where Parker Palmer's tragic gap becomes not just an idea, but a way of life. We don't stand in that gap alone. We stand there together. If Ash Wednesday does anything, it shows us that we are standing in the same human situation that none of us opted into on our own. We remind one another, from dust you have come, and also from love you have come. And in that, we refuse both cynicism and denial. And what we're doing is we're choosing presence. And so, we stand together as a community that knows what it is to grieve and to hope, to stay present when it would be easier to check out or kind of move on too quickly. We stand there when the smoke rises, whether it's literal or metaphorical, and we remind one another that presence itself is a form of love, that choosing not to look away is a moral and spiritual act, that staying tender in a hardened world is a quiet kind of courage. A number of years ago, when I was in my own Lenten season of kind of wandering and questioning and wrestling with my own experience of suffering, I wandered into the chapel at the Poor Clares over on Los Olivos Street here. It's kind of a small space and it's simple and quiet. And do you know what the very first thing I noticed was? A stained glass window, actually the first one to the left, in fact, and on it was this icon of St. Barbara. And I didn't know much about her at the time, but I learned something that day that kind of stopped me in my tracks. Did you know that St. Barbara is actually the patron saint of a happy death? A happy death? That's pretty wild, right? And yet something new in me knew almost instantly when I saw that Santa Barbara was going to be a place where I would have to learn to integrate death into my perspective. Not to become morbid or fearful, right? But to become more alive. To not shy away from mortality, but to learn how to live in spite of it, or maybe even because of it, with more intensity and urgency and depth and passion. Because when death is denied, life becomes thin. And when death is acknowledged, life becomes precious. So Ash Wednesday gives us permission to tell the truth about that. It invites us to stop pretending that time is endless. It invites us to release our illusion of control over our lives. It invites us to remember that our bodies are real and fragile and finite and beloved. And somehow, paradoxically, that truth doesn't diminish love. It actually deepens it. It cleans up our presence. And so when we hold our mortality close, we begin to ask better questions. Not, how do I protect myself from loss at all costs, but how do I want to love while I'm here? How do I want to show up for the people around me? What kind of human do I want to become in the time that I've been given? Because again, more ashes will come. We know that. But each time they do, we are invited again, both as individuals and as a community, to stand in solidarity with one another, to stand in that tragic gap, to hold one another between what is really going on and what could be, between suffering and healing, between loss and renewal, between death and love. And so tonight, you're each invited, if you wish, to receive ashes. There's no obligation, it's definitely not expected. It's simply a moment to pause, a moment to remember, a moment to let the truth of your own precious, finite life touch your bones, right? And as the ashes are placed on your forehead, you may hear words like, "From dust you have come, and to dust you shall return." And you may also hear, "From love you have come, and to love you shall return." Both are true, and both are held together here. So may these ashes remind us that our lives matter, that our love matters, that our presence right here, right now is enough. And may we leave this place a little more grounded, a little more tender, a little more willing to stand with one another in the ashes of our world, trusting that love is still at work in us and through us even now. Amen. All right, we've got 3 questions for discussion around the tables tonight. The first question is the self question. When you reflect on your mortality, what feels clearer about how you want to live? And perhaps where are you being invited to show up more fully? The second question is the sacred question. Where do you experience love from God or someone close to you holding you in the tragic gap between what is and what could be, and what helps you stay tender instead of cynical in our world. And lastly, the society question. As we face the ashes of our world, what might it look like for our community to stand in solidarity with those who are being oppressed in our time? Where are we being invited to embody love more concretely? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.